una cosita que sube.
Tiene una cosita que baja.
Ay, cómo sube.
Tiene una cosita que baja.
Ay, cómo sube.
Tiene una cosita que baja.
Tiene una cosita que sube.
Tiene una cosita que baja.
Lo que tiene Yoruba.
Tiene una cosita que baja.
Oye, yo soy lo que está sonando hasta después. Y si tú calientas, yo también caliento. Que dice Yoruba.
Soy lo que está sonando hasta después.
Welcome, everybody. This is the Pacific Northwest report back from our trip to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade. I would love to pass it off to Fern, who's going to tell us a little bit about the purpose of this call and why we've all invited you here today.
Yes, hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're so excited to share with you about the trip with you. Could we go to slide number 3, please? Yes, so before we get started, I would love to ground us in the purpose of this call. So we would like to, during this call, provide some political and historical context about what's happening in Cuba and their revolution, and our purpose as the 51st Venceremos Brigade for traveling there. We're also hoping to share a lot about our experiences being people from the US who visited Cuba during the 51st Brigade, and also to provide a space where everyone can grow collectively. Like, this isn't about us, it's about you, it's about everyone who's here and sharing knowledge and being able to grow in our understanding of what's happening in Cuba. And then finally, to encourage folks who are in the Pacific Northwest to organize with the Venceremos Brigade and other Cuba solidarity efforts. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to pass it back to Tom for some introductions and an icebreaker.
Thank you so much, Fern. Thanks for switching the slide, Molly. So for our icebreaker today, we're going to utilize a Jamboard. For those of you who are unfamiliar, you will get a link for the board in the chat section. You will simply click on the link, use your cursor to double click on the Post-its that are on the Jamboard itself, which will allow you to write and put your contribution to the conversation in it. You can then click Save, and you can move the Post-it where you would like it to go. Molly is showing us an example right now of how to utilize the sticky notes on the Jamboard. Please message in the chat if this is not accessible to you or if you'd like any further instructions. For our icebreaker that we'll be using the stickies for, I would love to ask everyone to list their name and the pronouns that you use so we can refer to you correctly. And then just let us know, what do you already know about Cuba? And what are you hoping to learn about Cuba? You could also write something about what brought you to this report back and what you're hoping to gain from it. So we'll give you a few minutes to just kind of add your stuff. I might read out loud some of the contributions as they come up. So please take your time and feel free to participate in this group activity. Thank you, John. We are now changing the settings so that everyone can participate with the Jamboard.
Just a note, you may need to reload the page for the setting to be applied.
I love it. Everyone is grabbing their sticky. Welcome Rain and Holly, also Fern and Sayer. Someone wrote that Cuba had a revolution in 1969. Cuba has been able to restore a lot of their ecology post-colonization. Thank you. Someone says they want to learn more about Cuba's medical internationalism. You are in luck. We will be talking about that today. Cuba has a long history of overcoming and also wanting to learn how I can be in solidarity with Cuba. That is great. Welcome, Maya. Welcome, David. I would also encourage, if you know the indigenous land that you're currently living on, you can also include that to give folks a little bit more context. Oh, there's a good one here. Oh, that was from Sulan. Okay. Benjamin, welcome. Awesome. Oh, interested to learn more about Cuba's agricultural practices and food justice efforts. We'll also be talking about that. That's great. Let's see. Oh, David said that he visited Cuba in 1980 and 2006 and was on a healthcare delegation. Wow. Cool. Maya said that they love learning about solidarity between Central America and Cuba. Yeah, me too. Oh, someone else just said, I know that Cuba is a country rich in their coffee. There's been a lot of political revolution within Cuba. I would like to learn more about the culture, people, and history. That's awesome. Then Angel has said that as a Puerto Rican independentista, I wonder about Cuba's Latin American solidarity work. Yeah, we'll definitely be talking about that too, Angel. Okay, Holly has said that they know a surface level history of Cuba. I'm interested in learning more about their social, political structures and ideas. Awesome. Okay. We've got about 3 more minutes, so we'll keep posting our little stickies and talking to each other. You don't need to hiss at him. Oh, someone wants to learn more about Cuba's medical internationalism. That is truly a very exciting topic, and I'm excited to hear about it too. Awesome. These are some really great
That's great.
Yeah. All right. Well, keep adding what you'd like to add to the Jamboard. I love hearing what people have to say. And in just a minute or so, I'm going to hand this off to Maya and Danny, who are going to be leading us through some really cool topics.
Whenever we're all ready, Molly, if you could put us back onto slide number 4, I think. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. I'm so excited to get started on this report back. We've been preparing for a little bit, so we're really excited. My name is Maya. I use any pronouns, and I was a member of the 51st Venceremos Brigade to Cuba. So let's learn a little bit about the Venceremos Brigade history. The VB sent its first delegation to Cuba in 1969, and we're an organization that sends anti-imperialists and also just US citizens in general to Cuba to go demonstrate our solidarity with the Cuban people and with their revolution. So far we've sent 51 brigades ever since. And our express purpose is to organize until the blockade is lifted. We'll get a little bit more into our 3 goals as an organization after this. The VB is the oldest US-Cuba solidarity organization. And then we also say we're also the youngest, as in our membership, you know, we bring a lot of young people. We're extremely gender diverse. We're very sexually diverse. It's a big thing for us to kind of like bring together oppressed people in the United States and really build those ties of international solidarity. And like these trips are an amazing opportunity for us to be able to build internationally and realize that like all of our liberation is tied together. So that's a really big thing about the Venceremos Brigade. Can we go to the next slide? So let's get into our goals of the Venceremos Brigade. Goal number 1, end the US blockade of Cuba, all US imposed travel restrictions, and all regime change programs. Basically, we don't want our government messing with Cuba, messing with the, you know, imposing limitations on us for where we can and can't go, and basically minding its own business, please and thank you. Goal number 2, let's go to the next slide. End the illegal US military occupation of Guantanamo Bay. We're going to learn a little bit more about this when we go into Danny's section about Cuban history, but this is a really big one for us as an organization. And then let's get into the 3rd goal. Goal number 3, strengthen movements for justice in the US through exchange and collaboration with Cuba. I think that's like a big part of where, you know, especially strengthening these ties between oppressed peoples, both in the United States and in Cuba, and realizing that, you know, we are not limited by the borders of our country. You know, all of us have something to learn from each other, and that is a really beautiful thing about the experience that the Venceremos Brigade provides. So I think that we can go into learning a little bit about Cuban history. So Danny, take it away.
All right, thanks, Maya. Yeah, I'm Danny. I use he, him pronouns, and I have a lot of history to cover and not too much time, so bear with me. But Cuba was originally peopled by the Tainos, the Siboney Tainos, and the Guanahatabe. Christopher Columbus made his initial invasion here and on Haiti, where in Haiti, the Taino chief Hatue, who's pictured here, took a canoe from Haiti to Cuba to alert the people and then gather enough people to lead a guerrilla war against Spain, which ultimately failed. But Hatue is remembered for being one of the first leading the first rebellions against Spain in all the Americas. He's a very important figure in Cuba. For a long time after Spanish colonization, Cuba was exploited for hundreds of years for sugar and for slavery. But eventually Cubans pride themselves on waging a 30-year revolution for independence from Spain from 1868 to 1898. And that's where we get some of Cuba's most revered national figures like Jose Marti and Antonio Maceo here. And then, unfortunately, at the very end of this war for independence, the United Snakes intervened, and they were able to negotiate a hostile and exploitative treaty with Cuba that established it more or less as like a neo-colony and an outpost for the United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita. They also, at this time, set up Guantanamo Bay as a permanent military base that is now completely illegally occupying Cuba's land. This was in 1903, and all this was from the Platt Amendment. After that, they just have a series of dictators in the interests of the U.S. ruling class and their business interests. And the Cuban people had their final straw with the last dictator, Fulgencio Batista. And we'll go to the next slide. So on July 26, 1953, a young radical lawyer named Fidel Castro Ruiz led an armed rebellion against the Moncada army barracks in Santiago de Cuba, which we'll have more on later. So this initial rebellion failed. Some of the revolutionaries were executed and made martyrs for their cause. Fidel and his brother Raul were exiled to Mexico, where eventually they meet the young Argentinian Dr. Ernesto Che Guevara, who had recently become radicalized by his travels through leper colonies in South America and his witnessing of the U.S. coup against Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala for the United Fruit Company. So Fidel, Raul, and Che all link up, and they start gathering dedicated comrades for training, fundraising, political education, stockpiling, and planning. And they're able to obtain a small 60-foot yacht called the Grandma, which I have in that picture on the right there. They set off from Tuxpan, Mexico in 1956 with just 82 people to Playa Las Colorados near Santiago de Cuba. They land and they're immediately stormed by Batista's troops. Only 21 out of the original 82 survive, but Fidel and Che are able to retreat from these troops, and they begin a guerrilla warfare campaign moving through Cuba that gathers intense momentum and support from everybody they come across. So finally, December 1958, after a victory by Castro and his forces in Santa Clara, which is near Havana, Batista just flees the country, and the revolutionaries proudly march to Havana, and they take control of the state for the people. So since then, the Cuban people have immediately benefited from the revolution. They have housing for all, free, universal, community organized healthcare, extremely high literacy rates. They send doctors all over the world, and education accessible for everybody. And that's my quick spiel.
Thanks so much, Danny, for condensing all of that history into a digestible bit. Let's get into the blockade. Some of you guys may have heard about this before. The US economic blockade on Cuba is the world's most enduring economic blockade of sanctions. It's estimated to have cost the Cuban people around $130 billion over the 6 decades of existence. It's basically a patchwork. It's not just like one single policy. It's kind of like a patchwork of different trade sanctions, policies, things like that take advantage of the United States' global economic power to strip the island of its ability to participate in the global economy and survive. It was first imposed on March 14th of 1958, actually before the revolution. It was only, at that point, it was only a weapons sanction. So it wasn't affecting too much of the island, but it was as a response to, this tension between the Cuban revolutionaries and the Batista regime. And then post-revolution, it's pretty immediately strengthened, especially after the Bay of Pigs. But if you go and look at the original, documentation when they're kind of putting this blockade together, the U.S. government, it's pretty explicit that the point of the blockade is to make life in Cuba so miserable that the Cuban people turn against their revolution, turn against their government, and then basically Cuba just reverts back to that kind of neocolonial past of just, being another country in the United States backyard, essentially, to just be exploited. The United Nations General Assembly has passed a resolution every year since 1992, so over 30 years now at this point, demanding the end of the US economic embargo on Cuba. And every country that's a part of that General Assembly, votes to get rid of it, with the exception being, of course, the United States and Israel. Every single year consistently, that's how it goes. Of course, the United States is not accountable to this assembly, but this is just kind of to show how globally unpopular it is, that the blockade has existed for this long. Getting into some of the details of the blockade, one thing that was really shocking to me when I was first learning about all of these details is, for example, Cuba can't import products that have more than 10% of the content originating from the United States. That's crazy. Another thing being, with the shipping barges, there's a sanction against basically, if a ship has landed in Cuba, it cannot go land and deliver its product to the United States for, I think, 180 days after. So imagine how difficult that is, Cuba being literally 90 miles away from the United States, and the United States being such a huge economy, such a huge population, such a consumer population, to be able to find companies that are willing and able to, import product to Cuba that they need as an island nation that is not able to, be fully self-sustainable just from, the geographic limitations. It's things like that that really put into perspective, how inhumane this blockade is, and You know, I really always think about the real human toll, the real human effect. Exactly as John is putting it in the chat, genocidal. This blockade is genocidal. So here at the Venceremos Brigade, you know, that's our mission. We're not going to rest until the blockade is lifted. We view this as our responsibility as citizens of the United States. Our government is the one doing this, and we stand up and we say no. We say this isn't right, and we do not agree with our government taking these actions on our behalf. So that's a little bit of information about the blockade. And I guess we can move on to the next section. Thank you.
Hello. So in this section, we're going to share a bunch of the different experiences and things that we learned while in Cuba. I will be kicking it off by talking a little bit about the Families Code. So they brought us together. We had this lovely panel with some queer activists and lawyers and stuff to talk about this momentous piece of policy that was actually passed last year. So the Family Code was a huge overhaul to the prior code that had existed, I believe, since the 60s. And it passed last year on the 25th of September, and it included so many amazing things with the goal of protecting every family and every family member in Cuba. Some highlights of this are it redefined marriage as a union between any two adults over 18. So this was really huge as it legalized all kinds of queer marriages, or not all kinds, but like many, it legalized same-sex marriage. It also guarantees equal access to IVF and adoptions, and that is also extended to same-sex couples and across different genders and sexualities. It included a number of gender equity guidelines for relationships and centered things like bodily autonomy and equal distribution of labor. It also included legally backed autonomy and decision-making that impacted minors. So it had a lot of impact on children's rights and youth. It also included a lot of different protections for and support for seniors, disabled people, and people who need like additional medical care. And it included the right to legally define family based on choice rather than biological or marital relation. So these are just a few of the highlights too. It was a very extensive and sweeping piece of legislation, and it quite literally created the most progressive family code in the entire world. And this just happened last year in Cuba, and we got to hear about it. Tom is going to tell us more about how this was passed and some of the opposition it faced and how that was overcome.
Thank you, Fern. By the way, I'm Tom, and I use she and they pronouns. So like any huge piece of legislature, a lot of prep and work went into passing this on the part of the people who wrote it and also the government, the Cuban government themselves. So there was, the legal process was collectively constructed through a consult process, and it was passed by referendum. So with any huge piece of legislature like this, there's of course going to be opposition or people that have different opinions or just concerns about what could be included in the legislature. So when we were in Cuba talking to folks about this, we asked like, how did you kind of quell the concerns of folks who opposed it? And people actually were trained by the government to go to people's community centers, to their homes, to their workplaces, and community organizations to explain the code more in detail. As Fern mentioned, it's a huge piece of legislature, and most people don't have the time to be reading pages and pages and pages of this kind of work. So people really went out and out of their way to kind of work through the kinks with people. As a lot of folks know, there are a lot of remnants of colonialism and Catholicism in Cuba and any place that's faced colonialism. So some of the concerns were religious. Some of the concerns are just based in, biases that people have against LGBTQ folks that we see worldwide. And a big thing that I think helped to change people's minds is that people reminded folks that all of the types of people that are included in this code are already living here in Cuba. This is protecting what already exists. So it's just ensuring that people have the safety and the rights that they need, that they're already going about trying to get in their daily lives. So I think that the support of people was really, and people already existing, and this not being some kind of new thing coming into Cuba, really helped to relieve people's fears. And also there was just like people working to counsel folks on their own biases, working through some of those things that are not based in logic, but rather based in the things that we're all trying to work through as human beings. And another part of it was just that every single family in Cuba was positively impacted by this legislature. This protects elders, this protects every part of your family, your kids, what goes wrong or what happens when something goes wrong in your marriage and you need to figure it out and you need support. Imagine a government being not just a government, but a community of people that want what's best for the families that they govern over. So I think that framing was really wild to hear about as someone who lives in the US, as a transsexual living through the plotted and planned genocide of my people that's currently happening. I can't even imagine what could happen or what could be possible if my government was actually going out door to door to people who are passing these bullshit laws and talking with them and like giving them the therapy and help that they need to not take out their anger on people like me. So hearing this kind of outreach approach that the Cuban government was so diligently doing just blew my mind. As a US citizen, I think I'm told so much of the time that I'm lucky to live in the US as a transsexual, as a faggot, as a queer person, and that if I were to go elsewhere, it'd be even worse for me. So I went elsewhere and I saw that things could be a whole hell of a lot better. And so hearing about this family code just opened up a lot of hope for me in my life. And I think for a lot of the other queer people on our trip. And I think it's the first time that I've ever been able to conceptualize legislature as a love letter to the people of Cuba and wanting to protect them. So yeah, there's so much information about this code. We could talk about it for hours, but these are a few highlights and just some of the things that I really tried to bring back with me, especially in these times.
Hey, folks, can you hear me? I'm Nick, use he, him pronouns, and was part of the 51st Brigade. I'm going to talk a little bit about Cuba's extraordinary healthcare system that's in place despite the blockade and the hardships it's created for the Cuban people that folks have already talked about. But I'm going to primarily talk about one aspect of Cuba's healthcare system that we learned about. The response to the pandemic and the development of COVID-19 vaccines. And just want to give a quick shout out to Lynn, who's on this call for a lot of help in developing the content for this section. The day we left for Cuba in late December, 262 people died of COVID in the US. And that same day, not one person died in Cuba. In fact, only 30 people in a country of 11 million reported even testing positive for COVID. That's really remarkable, and it's illustrative of what we learned and experienced regarding COVID during our time there. We were fortunate to visit a pharmaceutical lab in the eastern part of the country. There, we learned that Cuban scientists, out of necessity and in large part due to the blockade, quickly developed 3 vaccines that are about 93% effective in preventing death and severe symptoms from COVID. And since then have also developed a highly effective boosters. And Cuba was the first country in the world to create a vaccine for children ages 3 to 11 years of age. We received a really warm welcome when we arrived at the lab. The room was filled mostly with nurses, healthcare workers. And what was also really inspiring was to hear from brilliant medical and scientific leaders, almost all of whom were Black and Brown folks. The story around development, outreach, and implementation of their vaccine plan was also really inspiring. Cubans encouraged youth in developing the vaccines. Young medical students that we met went from house to house, doing contact tracing, searching for people with symptoms. They educated people about the importance of, wearing masks, social distancing, washing hands. They developed isolation centers to house people in quarantine at the height of the pandemic. And their medical students were among the 44,000 Cubans who volunteered for clinical trials during production of the vaccine. So it was, I think, like previous speakers have talked in other areas, a really communal response to the virus. Cuba also had a strong presence in international COVID relief efforts. What we learned during this discussion is that its Henry Reeve Brigade, established by Fidel Castro in the early 2000s, sent medical professionals to 39 other countries to assist with COVID relief in an international sign, show of solidarity. What's interesting is that, COVID and the vaccines in Cuba has not been politicized. It's truly been treated as the extraordinary public health crisis that it is. And we didn't hear about disparities among its people as to, who did or did not receive the vaccine, who contracted the disease, or who died from it. I've worked on some COVID-related issues here in the U.S. over the last couple of years, particularly in like prisons and jails, and seen the unwillingness, the justified unwillingness in Black and other communities of color to take the vaccine. A strong distrust in government-initiated medical campaigns that have played out in practice because of our government's longstanding, shameful history of experimenting on our communities with vaccines, with other medical trials. This was not the case there. Because of that, I think there was a trust amongst its people that the government had their best interests in mind. And what's also interesting is while there was no mandate that citizens take the vaccine, over 90% of their population is fully immunized. And that jumps to about 98% of children over 2, which is in stark contrast to what we've seen here. And as a result, as you can probably guess, a much lower mortality rate from COVID in Cuba than in the US, about 8,500 deaths there. And again, in a country of about 11 million people, which is in, again, stark contrast to what we've seen here, which is about 1.2 million deaths in a country of about 330 million. So in other words, significantly higher mortality rate in the US than in Cuba, despite that being a country with pretty serious economic and medical hardships that are caused by the blockade. All of this did not happen by chance. The effective, the nimble response to the pandemic, it's really what we learned, the result of a history of planning, prioritization, of investment in medical, biotech, pharmaceutical systems, and a priority on primary health care. As Danny stated earlier, free medical care is a fundamental right for every Cuban. And even as visitors, some of our brigadistas experiencing medical issues during our time there were the beneficiaries of a healthcare system that really treats people like patients instead of clients. Their medical system prioritizes nurses' rights as workers. We learned, and over 4 decades ago, Fidel Castro began prioritizing investment in biotech research and development. And so as a result, they now have world-renowned medical research centers and healthcare facilities like the ones we visited. Just lastly, Its strong medical infrastructure allows them to produce many of their own medicine and health-related treatments, including the vaccine we've talked about. They have a rich history of doing that for other diseases that have hit the country hard, such as dengue, yellow fever, malaria, other respiratory diseases. And they applied these methods to create the COVID vaccines. This, as we mentioned earlier, despite how the blockade has made doing so really just exponentially more difficult. And as one speaker, actually, as a number of people have stated during our visit there, said, given what they're doing in light of the blockade, just imagine what would be possible if the blockade was lifted. I think that's with regards to healthcare, medical care, and everything else that we experience. So that's a somewhat brief overview of what was a really memorable opportunity to learn more about the pandemic in Cuba, and hopefully it was informative. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Sulan. I use they, them pronouns. I'm on Molly's Zoom, so it says Molly, but I'm not. Just like everybody that has presented so far, it's sort of like you guys are on a mini Venceremos Brigade. When we go on our trip, we go and make all these different little visits, and the 52nd was so special because we traveled across the east side of the island. Towards the end of the trip, we got to visit a children's hospital that felt really impactful for me, particularly because my mom growing up was a midwife. And so I spent a lot of time, like in hospitals and birthing centers and with other midwives talking about maternal mortality and talking about race and babies, talking about impacts of westernized medicine, yada, yada. And as a grown-up, I work for a healthcare workers union. And when we got to the children's hospital, I was ready to learn about all of the amazing things that Cuban healthcare, the Cuban medical system has done. And we did learn about that, and I'm going to share. But what we also learned about was a couple of things that felt so exciting and surprising, and also like some of the previous comrades have been sharing, like how possible the worlds we want to live in becomes when you're in Cuba. On the picture on the screen, the person all the way to the left-hand side wearing like the stripy skirt situation and the blue mask, that is the union steward for the hospital. It was really surprising and incredible to hear the process of how unions function at workplaces in Cuba. At this hospital, the union steward talked about the way that they create healthy working environments for the workers at the hospital, making sure that people's work processes are functional for them, and solving problems when needed. It felt like the dream of unions that every day in my life here we fight for, and just really different outcomes. Okay, so healthcare in Cuba is amazing. I'm sure many of y'all have learned so much from it. And before I share this part, shout out to John Ju, who did so much of this work and just like a lot of the brilliance of the framing and gathering. During the 1959 Cuban Revolution, one of the things that got into their healthcare, into their constitution is healthcare. In 1959, the mortality rate for people having babies was 39 people died out of every 1,000. And right now, the maternal mortality rate is way, way, way less. It's about 4 people per every 1,000. So we see this huge, huge change. And even when we're looking at kids under 5, really similar patterns. And the rates now at this part of the revolution are way lower than the United States. The United States mortality for kids under 5 is up close to 7 deaths per 1,000, and in Cuba it's 4 deaths per 1,000. And this is how they do it. The introduction of healthcare in the Cuban Revolution Constitution laid the foundations for medical internationalism. They everywhere tell us it's not charity. We do it in solidarity. They go to other countries, have offered to come to the United States and send doctors and medical professionals everywhere. 400,000 Cuban medical professionals traveled in 164 countries since the revolution started. They have ILAM, which is the largest medical school in the Western Hemisphere. And at this very cool children's hospital that we went to in Camagüey on the east side of the island, we learned about the hospital moving from a privatized hospital to a nationalized hospital, a service for 150,000 people in the region. They have both primary level care that happens mostly in the neighborhood, focus on prevention, including access to fresh food. Doctors and nurses immediately know the conditions and the history of the people in their neighborhood. When they say like primary care provider, they're not talking about like a once a year visit. They're talking about, I know you, I visit your house, and I know your whole family. And again, this really strong presence of not only just the trade union, like I shared earlier, but also the Communist Party, a connection between the ideological practice of how they provide care, that the care is for the people, and making sure that that connects to the actual care that they provide. Just such a cool experience. And I'm gonna pass it back.
Hi, I am actually the Molly for this account. My name is Molly Benitez. I use they, them pronouns. And I am going to be talking about the Cuban education system. A little bit about the educational system is that it was nationalized in 1959 and that it's free. Cuba has the highest literacy rate in the world. And then I just have this quote by Jose Marti. It says, people can only be free if they are truly educated. And so one of the highlights for me on this trip is we were able to go talk to a couple of professors when we were in Camagüey. And it was really just, I guess I should say that I myself am a professor. There were 3 of us actually on the trip. Roberto, who's going to speak after me, and Evelyn, who's in the audience, yay, who so graciously shared these notes from our trip, because I like to live in the moment, so I took no notes. But this is just a little bit about some of the professors that we saw. One of them brought 10 books for us to give away, and they talked a little bit about the 1994 Path of the Enslaved, which explored cultural interactions born from enslavement and its impacts on various regions. And then probably this stuck out to me the most because I teach, and I teach in the US, and I teach in like a gender studies and teaching race and ethnic studies. And when we were at this presentation, one of the professors talked about how Cuba didn't have systemic racism, and it was really kind of mind-blowing because as somebody who teaches and tries really hard to make sure that my students understand, you know, that racism and prejudice and all that is not about the individual, like one-to-one kind of racism, but about how it is actually our entire like government and country is like founded on white supremacy and anti-Blackness. It feels like such an important thing I talk about in every single class, and it really like threw me to hear that there was no systemic racism in Cuba, and even like on the whole time back, it just is stuck in my head, and I thought about it a lot. I talked to a couple of professors in the US who do Cuban studies, and they were like, yeah, and they tried to explain to me, and I still feel like I'm having such a hard time because it's such a paradigm shift for me. But it really has been making me think about like what is possible, you know, yeah, I still have a hard time talking about it. I'm still trying to figure out like how to even think about it because it's so different than what I know. So that was a thing that really stuck out to me. I'll pass it to Roberto to talk a little bit more about it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Roberto. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about, I just want to piggyback off of what Molly was talking about in terms of systematic racism. That was particularly important for me to listen and try to comprehend, because one of the things that the professors spoke about, not just the professors that sat on this panel, but just hearing from other artists from around the country and people who would be identified as Black or brown here in the United States. We're using our United States framework to try and understand race and the foundations that come with it and the racial formations that have been predicated by the US empire. One of the things that stood out to me at that particular panel from the previous pictures is that the professors said that previous to us coming in, that we went into a park where there was a memorial, and they spoke on that prior to the revolution, that people who were of Afro descent could not hang out at that park. So Cuba was when it was under the Batista dictatorship, they had their own forms of Jim Crow and systematic racism. So that's why this is really important to discuss. And the other things that they talked about is just, that the revolution allowed for them to pursue degrees, not just in high school, but just to get a bachelor's degree and advanced degrees. And they credit a lot to the Cuban Revolution, and because of this, they were unable. They didn't have any ways to get any sort of education, so that they found that was really important. The other thing too that I wanted to also talk about is that when we went to come away, we went to go visit the Ignacio Agramante Memorial, which is this really amazing statue that commemorated the history of Cuba solidarity and Cuba fighting back, going all the way back to the mid-19th century, and all the way to the recent Cuban Revolution of 1959. But as we sat there, we were listening to this professor right here on the right, and I couldn't help to think that the word free kept coming to mind, like we're getting a free lecture from a professor who teaches at Camagüey, who's a historian. But I was having such a difficult time removing this American framework that I came with, meaning the word free, because as you know, a lot of us have crippling student debt, and that we're going to be paying back for a very long time. Cuba doesn't have this. So that was really, really salient and a really profound moment for me to think about, like, that we're sitting in the good graces of this professor who was kind enough to give us a history lesson of the region and the province. Somebody had a council earlier, so we were fortunate to sit and listen to him. And one of the things that he talked about was that he was a veteran of the Angola War in the 1970s. And he talked about like some of these decolonial practices that Cuba was involved in trying to help liberate Angola, Congo, and South Africa. And one of the things that he also mentioned too is just being confronted with the empire and how important that was for him and his comrades to push back. And through that, through these talks, Abraham was one of our guides, and he was part of the Friendship Institute that talked to me about getting this book called Conflicting Missions, Havana, Washington, and Africa, 1959 through 76. And for me, that's really important because not only are the Cuban people really, really deeply committed to solidarity in these decolonial practices, but that's a narrative that we have never been taught here in the United States. So I say this because it's really important to think about with the solidarity movements that Cuba has been participating in, and in this way to think about like the people who have lived in these struggles are also part of the community, and they're also professors, and they're also talking to us about what they have been through and what they're also learning and from us as well. And we're, one of the things that we talked about between Molly and Evelyn is like, we would like to go back and hopefully, teach them the ways of the United States and how there are a lot of people, particularly marginalized communities in the United States, are still struggling for our own liberation here. So with that, I want to pass it on. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, early on in our trip, just a second, sorry. And thanks for that, Roberto. So sorry, early on in our trip, we went to Fidel Castro's childhood home, which is in a town called Biran, which is between Holguin and Santiago de Cuba. So this is a land of like 11,000 hectares. It has 11 houses now, and it was 27 during operation. So they've tried to keep and preserve as much of it as they could, you know, but some of it gets lost. The main childhood home of Fidel that we went into had actually been burned down by his dad, who fell asleep with a lit cigar. And they moved the family a little bit over, and that home is perfectly preserved. The other one was rebuilt and like as close to specifications as possible. This was a really interesting, I feel like, visit to the house. I didn't, you know, I thought, oh, this would be cool, you know, a little piece of history when we were going. But it was really interesting because I think like my main takeaway from this, and I know a lot of my other comrades that went on the trip, it's that Fidel is like a huge class trader. Like he grew up really rich. This land had a school, like a bar, a cheese factory, a butchery, a graveyard, machine workshops, a separate house for his grandma, a cockfighting ring, and then working quarters for the Haitians who his dad had as pretty much slaves in a post-slave Cuba. And he grew up with all of that and then kind of threw it all away for the people and for the revolution. It was just interesting. Like he keeps the working quarters there, but that's no longer the case in Cuba at all. Everybody's free and equal, and there's no type of labor like even close to being as exploitative as that exists in the country. And then I just thought, like in a way more trivial way, but the cockfighting ring was interesting because that became illegal on two fronts. There was like immediately animal cruelty laws passed after the revolution, and also gambling laws because Cuba had a lot of casinos that the U.S. put in there for tourists. And so, yeah, I just want to like bring up, it was a really beautiful kind of rich land that we went to, pretty to look at, but the whole time it was thinking, wow, you know, Fidel grew up in all of this and he was still able to connect with the people in such a profound way, in a lasting way. And I think that's all I got.
Hi, it's Molly again. I'm back. I'm going to be talking a little bit about when we visited the organic urban garden in Cuba, and a little bit about the VB. A core of VB is solidarity labor. So it's solidarity labor alongside political, education, community discussion, and travel. The VB has historically done solidarity labor since the very beginning, and some of the work has included harvesting sugarcane, painting buildings, repairing structures, hauling materials, etc. And so we were able to go and work for 2 days on this urban garden. The work is really accessible for all people of capacities and abilities, which John is going to talk a little bit more about. One of the things that I found really amazing, I love to garden at home, but it was really interesting that this garden worked on aquaponics, which is, you can like Google it. I was going to put a little picture up here, but underneath these like garden beds that you see were actually catfish like pools, I guess, underneath. So there was a couple of little grates where you could look down and see the catfish swimming back and forth. And so it works in this way in which, you know, the catfish live down under the water beds. You know, they eat, they poop, that like vitamin rich water goes back into the garden. And then when there's rainfall, that water goes back down into the, to where the catfish are. And it's just like a continuous cycle where they're always getting healthy vitamins into the plants. And so it's like I've never even seen that before here in the US. And so it was really cool to see these catfish working. So I'll pass it to John to talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. So what you're seeing here is, I think, like Molly said, the largest organic garden in Cuba and in Latin America. And a lot of what we did there, we did a whole range of things, you know, regardless of what kind of skill or ability or experience you have. So there were some people who picked tomatoes. A lot of us just pulled weeds. And then there were people who actually like broke the manure, and we put them in as the kind of like the fertilizer. And also, like, you know, it felt really good. I was talking about this with my roommate, and actually in the presentation report back that they did earlier this year, they were talking about how, you know, for them, like, it was really what felt amazing was that the labor that we provided was not alienated from the people, that we knew where the work that we did was going, that the people who worked on the urban garden said that, you know, we contributed to about 15 days of labor, and that the food that they got there are going to the schools, they're going to the clinics, and to concretely advance the Cuban Revolution. And so that essence of what we talked about earlier, I think Solon was talking about this idea of like solidarity, not charity, that like that felt really real, because we also like we were asked by the brigade that the clothes that we had on, the gloves, the shoes that we had was all donated back to was donated to the people who work at this organic garden. And you know, we all just throughout the trip, we gave medical supplies to schools, or to hospitals, and school supplies to schools, and personal hygiene, condoms, all kinds of things to, you know, institutions, clinics, mass organizations. And the reason for that, like beyond feeling good, is that it's, again, I think what Maya was talking about is like, it literally is because everything that we have, they need and more because of the US blockade, and which is an active and more intensifying project. And like, even when Roberto was talking earlier about the support in like Angola and in Africa, like historically, the US doubles down, and the blockade and the actions of the US get more intensified to the Cuban people when Cuba actively provides military and medical internationalism and support to colonized people. So that was just really, really amazing. And we got to go there for 2 days, 2 different days, and learned with them. And then the next slide, Molly, is just a little gift from the farmers. They just to express their appreciation, they cut coconuts for us to drink from, and we had fresh coconuts. I think for some people it was like the first time, but it was just like a really memorable experience for me. And just to being on the land. One of the things in preparation for the trip, I remember for the 50th Brigade, there's this video that you all should watch. It says, you know, I think one of the people says, like, you know, what it's like to be on liberated land. And it was such a profound experience to really like take that in, and for that to arm sort of our revolutionary spirit and what we need to come to build back here in the US. So anyway, next. We got a little switcheroo.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Lynn. My pronouns are she, her. And I want to talk about the Moncada. A few of us visited the Moncada while we were in Santiago de Cuba. And this is one of the most inspiring places I saw on our Cuban trip. Danny earlier showed us a group of 21 rebels coming off their ship onto the shores, Fidel and the group of rebels. It was early dawn on January 26, 1953, when they reached this Moncada here. They were prepared to boldly attacked this garrison because they thought there was a huge number of weapons there, and they wanted to get those weapons, and they thought that this would be the beginning of the revolution, that it would be sewn up. But the attempt to take this garrison failed because news of their attack had leaked, and Batista met them and opened fire on them. So Danny said, you know, there was 21 that made it from to here out of, what was it, 80 something. But here, over half of them were killed, and the other 12 of them, including Fidel, were imprisoned on these grounds. However, the attack did change Cuba's course of history. It laid the basis for a successful revolution 6 years later in 1959. While in prison, Fidel wrote his most famous and decisive thesis called "History Will Absolve Me." He wrote it on napkins in lemon juice. And next slide, please. And this woman on the right, this is a book about Heidi Santiago. Let's see, she was a guard in the prison, and she was a revolutionary as well. And she snuck out the napkins of lemon juice one by one and wrote them up and disseminated them to the Cuban workers, which did actually inspire revolution right here. So in a way, it was the center of the revolution. But she was found out. This is a very inspiring book of her sacrifices. She was found out, and they brutally tortured her by bringing boxes of the body parts of her husband and her father to show her. So when I was sitting there looking at the Moncada and hearing these stories, I kind of choked up a little because I'm 72 years old. And for most of my life, since I was in my early 20s, we used to say, revolution in our lifetime. Well, it's, 60 years later. So this was a very powerful moment for me, because to think of going back to our country, this beast of a country, and how do we make a revolution, and knowing that the sacrifices we have to make are going to be as equally as intense as this. But being in Cuba and seeing all the wonderful advances, the things that you've heard about on the show today, has made Cuba a beacon for workers and socialists and revolutionaries all over the world. And that was something that I learned at the end of the trip, just how many countries, every continent, there's a huge number of countries that people come from to see how has Cuba done this? How has Cuba built a socialist country? And it's inspiring for everyone, not just me, but everyone, to see that this could be our future, a socialist country. So I think this trip was amazing, and everyone should go.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Wow, we have gone over so much today. It just really has brought such a smile to my face to hear all of my fellow brigadistas speak to their experiences and just be able to kind of relive just a little bit of our experiences together in Cuba. So thank you so much. For those of y'all who have joined us to hear about the Venceremos Brigade and about Cuba, we'd like to open the floor up to have some question and answer time. So if there's things that you heard during our presentations that you wanted to know a little bit more about, if there are things that you came to the meeting with today, like that we put on our post-it notes earlier, that you still wanted to ask about, now is the time. And before we start and open the floor, I would just like to go over a few group agreements that we utilize here at the Venceremos Brigade, and that we just ask that you participate in with us today. They are now posted on the slide, but I will just read through them quickly as well. The first is equitable labor in sharing and asking, take space and make space, push beyond your growing edge when learning with us today, listen with respect, and trust the intent of people around you, but also acknowledge the impacts. Get into some depth without drowning. One mic, one voice. Let's share and all hear each other. And let's struggle together, because the treatment of us as US citizens is important. And when we talk about Cuba and learn about the way that things could be, it's important that we think about the ways that our experiences here in the US are all connected, no matter who we are, and that our liberation here is collective and worth fighting for together. So with that, please feel free to come off of mute or even type your questions in the chat box if that feels better. And one of us who has been on the brigade will, speak up if it's a question that really speaks to us, and we'd like to talk about it with you. And I'm just looking over these sticky notes too to see if there's any things there we can start with.
I see one from Angel that I don't know how much we directly touched on, but Angel says, as a Puerto Rican independentista, I wonder about Cuba's Latin American Solidarity Network. I know just from talking to people on the street there, I met somebody that worked in Casa de Caribe, which is an organization for all the Caribbean states, and that there's a lot of that and organizing for that in Cuba and solidarity with their geographic neighbors in the Caribbean and in Central America. There's also the exchange of doctors that's been ongoing. And just another thing that was, I think, interesting. This isn't, directly Latin American, but just solidarity with oppressed nations and actually existing socialist states. A lot of the people that we talked to did mention support and international solidarity with the DPRK. So there was a lot of international solidarity expressed on our time there.
All right, I have, thank you so much, Dan, first of all. I have a question here in the chat from Holly, who said, I'd love to know some resources for learning more about Cuba, books, film, or podcasts. And I'm not looking directly at you, John, but I feel like a lot of us, including you, might have some great suggestions for Holly.
Maybe I should take this because we are going to be talking about that at the very end. So I want to invite you to just hold it, and then we'll say a little bit more at the very end.
Sounds good. Thank you, Nova. And I see that John posted a YouTube video from Belly of the Beast as well in the chat, Holly. It's a film series that's really great to share with people. And then I have another question. Besides report back presentations like this one, what does the solidarity work look like now that all of you have returned? Nova, is that something you also want to talk about? Awesome. Thank you so much, Nova.
Well, during my piece, I'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to get to that at the very end.
Yeah, Nova will be giving us some great offerings at the end of this time together today about how to get further involved with Cuba Solidarity and the Venceremos Brigade, just as a heads up. Oh, thanks, Danny. That's a great suggestion as well. Y'all are always giving me ideas too. And of course, if any of our presenters today have anything they want to elaborate on or share with any of us, don't be shy, or be shy if you want to be. That's okay.
I'd like to share a little something. I have traveled pretty extensively through Central America and, of course, in the United States as well. So those were definitely experiences that I was carrying with me while I was visiting Cuba. And this may seem a little incidental to people, but I cannot describe how incredible it was to go to a city and not feel totally overstimulated by ads everywhere, trying to be, being sold things at every corner. Everything was just, there was a lot of, I felt, beautification taking, although obviously there is like a lack of resources and things because of the blockade. Like, people were really taking care of their public places. Everyone was out in the streets late at night, hanging out, playing music, things like that. It was a really beautiful, kind of really visible communal culture of just togetherness. And it seemed, I don't know how to describe it. It was just such an amazing feeling. I recommend for everyone to go and experience it for themselves, because it's like nothing I've ever seen throughout Latin America and throughout the United States. So to me, that really demonstrates the power of a socialist project, even with, all of the contradictions and problems and anything like that. Like, it shows to me that this is a path that is worth taking. So that's my little piece.
Thank you so much, Maya. I remember when we were first like venturing out and thinking of like, do we want to stop at a shop or a store? And so many of us were like, oh, it looks like all the stores are closed. And then we realized they were all open. There just weren't like neon lights and signs everywhere that were like bogging down your brain with stimuli. It was very cool.
Yeah, that was the one thing that I have to say too, is that we spent about a couple of weeks in two parts, the eastern part of the country, and it wasn't dirty and it was very clean. I say that because the United States, we're a consumer society, and people, if you want to go buy a cup of coffee at Starbucks, you can't do that there in the same way that you could here. And what that does is that people are not throwing away their garbage out in the street. So we're not bogged down by capitalism in the sense of just how the eyesores that surround us, and we're just at neon lights of advertisements, which was great. It was a nice departure to be away from that. Because let's face it, that stuff is just garbage anyway. They're trying to sell stuff that we don't need. And it also made for a very clean society too. And the other thing too, I wanted to share that The Economic War Against Cuba by Salim Lamarni is a really good book to have a sound understanding of what's going on in terms of the sanctions in the blockade. It's not that long of a book. It's about, I think, about 100 pages. So if you're somebody who doesn't want to be bogged down by a bunch of reading, this gives you a really good, it packs quite much and in about 100 pages to have a better understanding of what Cuba is currently enduring.
And then can I just point out, we have, I think we have folks like sharing on the chat, some books and other resources. And so we have Cleanest Country I've Ever Been in, and Absolutely No, oh, sorry. I thought that was the name of a title of a book. There were Happy Yappies books, Beginner's Guide to Cuba. Maybe y'all can just like share it out loud. I know that like for me, reading poetry and writing from Jose Marti has been, I've been reading them in Spanish, but also they have translations into English, has been really eye-opening in terms of like the giving me context for like how they approached the creation of like their new government, their society.
Also on Maya, you added a comment about absolutely no homeless and just talking in like, impressions of the city. It was really interesting for me to go there. I work at homeless shelters in Portland. And so I focused on the questions I wanted to ask people about that. And the universal thing that people said is that nobody dies on the streets in Cuba. It's not a thing. You can go and be seen by a doctor for free. And everywhere there's doctors around every block instead of Starbucks. And this kind of touches on one of the questions on the Jamboard too. I see somebody said that they're interested to learn more about Cuba's agricultural practices and food justice efforts. And so for the food justice, one of the things I learned is that like if you are homeless or if you are struggling to get food, that there are community restaurants that will give 3 free meals a day. So people can have full square meals, even if they don't have a place to live, which also doesn't really seem to be a thing there. They say that people, like people have housing and their family will let them live if something's wrong with their housing, like in there. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Just to piggyback off what Danny said, one of the things I distinctly remember was one of the last programs that we had, and it was from ICAP, the Solidarity Organization in Cuba, and they brought speakers and people from different sects of like Cuban government. And Fernando Gonzalez, he was one of the Cuban 5. He was a political prisoner in the U.S. And one of the things that he shared was that, like, I can't quite remember exactly how it was, but it's like, this idea of like, a lot of people ask this question. They're like, is there poverty in, Cuba and North Korea, like these, socialist countries? It's like, it's I don't think it's so straightforward, like as an American, to be like, oh, there is like, it's like, there's no such thing as no poverty at all. I saw people on the streets. And it's like, one of the things I got from what Fernando said was like, all the conditions get deeply exacerbated by the blockade. And so whatever you see, it looks like, as Americans, we might be like, oh yeah, that's a lie. Of course, I saw this guy out in the plaza and he looked houseless, but I have no information about like the context around that. And so it was just really helpful to kind of have that framed in that way. And that one of the other things that another brigadista shared in one of the first report backs was that in Cuba, it's literally illegal. You can't own more than 2 properties, so one in the city, one in the rural area. And that's just like, it just blows my mind, like we could house people if all the fucking rich ass landlords and people who just are sitting on all these empty houses, if that was made illegal, or if it was enforced so that, that housing is nationalized, just like all these other aspects of Cuban society that people are talking about.
I see another question on the Jamboard that I think all of us would probably have a wonderful answer for here on the panel. Rain, she, they, Cuba has a long history of overcoming. How can I be in solidarity with Cuba? So if anybody wants to take the lead on that.
Maybe that's a good segue to Nova.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Thank you. Okay, so hi, my name is Nova. You can use my name as my pronoun. I have just a few minutes to talk to y'all about I think the most exciting part about getting amped up from both like the moving of like knowledge in your heart, but also in your mind, and how we can do what, Paulo Freire talks about in terms of the reflection and action upon the world in which we want to transform. And so there are a couple of things that are going on right now. One is that a big effort is being done now to stop the U.S. Congress from making the state-sponsored terrorist list law. And in case you don't know already, Cuba is on that list. And so there's an effort right now and we can put the link in the chat, to contact our local representatives to tell them to vote no on HR 314, because it'll be a lot harder to stop, all of these sanctions against Cuba if we make the state-sponsored terrorist list law. The second thing I think, which is really important, is that before like jumping into action, which I think that, is like very much a symptom of white supremacy, is to like make moves without thinking.
is to really like spend some time in contemplation and reflection after you've like learned more things. And so something that is really, I think, more unique about the Venceremos Brigade is that we really encourage and have at the onset and also throughout our kind of experience is a lot of political education. So we encourage you to get your political ed on. I have some, like a link to a YouTube video that has some really good information about why we still go to Cuba. We have our like very brand baby new YouTube for Venceremos Brigade. And one of the working groups that we have is a political education group. And we did a recording of our U.S. interventions in Latin America in case you want to help get like a little bit of that grounding. Another really great way to kind of have that like beginning or just fill in some gaps is the Belly of the Beast Cuba. They just have really great information via storytelling that's happening on the ground. And in case you wanted to kind of like have something like playing and be able to listen and look and even look at Cuba, you know, from afar, and do that with like a few other people and then discuss it. I think that's a really great way to do so. We mentioned already a bunch of books and I think films that you can like look up and read and watch and listen to. And I think that the more you start like digging for stuff, the more that you will like learn about other references to things. Because like, for example, once I learned about, you know, once I read some like speeches about Fidel Castro, I read that he referenced Jose Marti. And so then I went to go look up Jose Marti's writings and it's kind of like everything's connected. And so I think that once you just go into stuff and you start looking things up, then it'll connect you to more things. And in the same way that you're connecting to people, right? The more people that you're talking to about these things, the more recommendations you can get. I also think that the National Network on Cuba is a great place to start in case you're interested in learning a little bit more about what's happening in terms of like news and updates. And getting a chance to kind of get connected to the really robust network of solidarity efforts around the United States, because the VB is just one of many kind of solidarity groups. And so if you go to that website and they share, I think you can sign up for email updates on that website, and they'll send you kind of opportunities, not only for when there's like a brigade that, you know, like VB is one of the many brigades. So like when there's a VB or when there's a brigade coming up, or there's just other like new efforts like that petition to stop the US Congress from making the state-sponsored terrorist list law, they will be kind of like a main stop. And then depending, right, I think that everybody here is in the Pacific Northwest. If you're not, it's totally fine. But usually there's like some efforts that are happening in person. And so like we'll have ongoing fundraising for those of you who know how to make some money for folks, and to also like, for folks to like go over to Cuba and get kind of educated in that political ed in that way, but also in terms of like gathering materials that we bring over in solidarity as well. So that's a really important piece about our solidarity work. Then there's also monthly car caravans that are happening in some major cities across the US. Depending on where you are, there might be one close to you. That's not something that we're currently doing just yet, but I think that that's something that has happened here in the Pacific Northwest, and it's definitely an example of something that we can do more of. Then there's also the upcoming VB52 Cuba trip, which is happening in July of next year. We went on our trip this past like winter, and so we're just needing a little bit of more space. So in case you were interested, there's like plenty of time for you to think about it and get connected. And one of the great ways of like, I think being able to really understand more depth of the history is to be able to go and see Cuba for yourself and talk to folks and ask questions and reflect on that. And so we have a Google form in case you're interested in learning more, or if you're interested in helping to fundraise and possibly joining the Pacific Northwest local committee, because we have local committees for different geographical spaces of the VB, to be able to give folks a chance to connect with people closest to them, as well as to the national network. So those are a couple of examples that are of what like we're doing now. And I think that sometimes we'll also, if something comes up, like I think when the pandemic hit, there were local solidarity efforts to like send some medical supplies to Cuba. And so some things like that will come up, and it's really just, it's not really about preparing, it's just about being in the know, and then kind of making haste when we're called upon to show up in solidarity. And stop there in case y'all have any questions about any of those things. And I think that we are at time, but if there's one or two things real quick, I can answer. Okay. That means that we did a great job. Okay, so since we're at time, I'll invite everybody to close out with us doing this Farm Workers Unity clap. And so it is, if you are able to make noise, you can go off of mute and do this. If you are not able to make noise where you are, that's totally fine. You can mimic it with your hands. And so this is an action that originated with the United Farm Workers as a way to bridge the communication gap between Latino and Filipino workers who did not share the same language, but wanted to still build a bond with one another as they were creating unions to receive better wages and better working conditions, etc. And so it's an action to kind of signify the collective gathering is coming to an end, or when we've made a decision. So you will follow me. This is how we do it. I will begin clapping slowly and then invite you to join me as you'd like, as we get like faster and faster and faster. Okay, get ready. And if you want to chant with us and say Venceremos, then you can chant with me one more time. 1, 2, 3. Venceremos.
Venceremos.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, y'all. And stay connected.
For coming. Hi, Benjamin.
you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Angel. Hi, Andrea. Hey, we did it!
Good job, everyone.
Nice job. That was
All that
excellent.
hard work paid off.
I'm glad it's recorded.
I feel relief.